in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Green Meadow, where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, and the houses exuded an air of tranquility, lived Mrs. Thompson and her mischievous cat, Whiskers. Mrs. Thompson, a kind-hearted woman with a penchant for gardening, enjoyed the peacefulness of her surroundings. Little did she know that her idyllic life was about to take an unexpected turn. It all began one sunny afternoon, when Mrs. Thompson was hanging her laundry out to dry in the backyard. As she reached for a pair of socks, she noticed something peculiar tucked inside. Pulling it out, she discovered a crumpled piece of paper, its edges frayed and worn. Curiosity piqued, Mrs. Thompson unfolded the paper and squinted at the hastily scrawled words. "Help! I'm being held hostage by a furry fiend. Send reinforcements ASAP." Baffled, Mrs. Thompson frowned, trying to make sense of the mysterious message. Glancing around, she spotted Whiskers lounging lazily in the shade, his green eyes gleaming with mischief. Realization dawned on her. Her beloved cat was the culprit behind this bizarre note. Chuckling to herself, Mrs. Thompson shook her head at Whiskers' antics. Little did she know that this innocent prank would soon spiral into a whirlwind of chaos. Later that evening, as Mrs. Thompson was preparing dinner in the kitchen, the doorbell rang, breaking the peaceful silence of the house. Wondering who could be visiting at such an hour, she wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the front door. To her surprise, standing on her doorstep was Officer Jenkins, a stern-faced policeman from the local precinct. His brows were furrowed in concern as he held out a crumpled piece of paper, the same note Mrs. Thompson had found in her neighbor's socks. "Ma'am, we received a distress call reporting a hostage situation," Officer Jenkins said, his voice grave. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. "A hostage situation? But that's impossible. It was just a silly prank by my cat." Officer Jenkins arched an eyebrow skeptically, clearly unconvinced by her explanation. "Ma'am, we take every call seriously. Can I take a look around your property just to be sure?" With a sigh, Mrs. Thompson nodded, leading Officer Jenkins through the house and into the backyard where Whiskers was lounging, looking innocent as ever. As Officer Jenkins inspected the surroundings, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel a pang of embarrassment. She knew how absurd the situation must seem. A cat causing a commotion worthy of a police response. Just then Whiskers sauntered over, his tail held high in the air. With a mischievous glint in his eyes, he nudged Officer Jenkins's leg and let out a playful meow. Officer Jenkins chuckled, his stern expression softening. "Looks like your cat is quite the character, ma'am." Relief flooded over Mrs. Thompson as she realized that the situation was finally under control. Thanking Officer Jenkins for his understanding, she watched as he made his way back to his patrol car, shaking his head in amusement. As the door closed behind him, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Who would have thought that a simple note hidden in a pair of socks could cause such a stir? From that day on, Mrs. Thompson made sure to keep a closer eye on Whiskers, knowing full well that her mischievous feline had a knack for getting into trouble. But despite his antics, she couldn't imagine life without him, the furry culprit behind the neighborhood's most unforgettable prank.